this is Loving the Spectrum. If you're new to our channel, we put out videos once a week, generally on Fridays, sometimes on the weekend, and we cover content based on our own experiences as queer non-binary autistics. And we make this content for other autistics, LGBTQ+ folks, and simply anyone else that's here to learn.
This means that we're happy to interact with those in our audience that are here to learn, but will ultimately prioritize the voices of those in our communities.
If this sounds like the place for you, then subscribe for more of our content.
We've also created a link tree so that it's easier to stay connected across all our channels. If you're able to contribute financially to help support us and the continued creation of our content, you can donate to us directly through that link tree. Since we are both disabled and unemployed, it is difficult for us to support ourselves, and we are both currently relying on family.
We both really want and need more financial independence, so if you can support us in any way, it would be really just greatly appreciated. April is also Autism Awareness Month, and donating directly to autistics is the best use of actual funds.
A lot of us don't actually support the autistic organizations that currently exist, so it's much better to find autistic creators, small businesses, and most importantly, GoFundMes to support. I think during last week's video, I neglected to mention the GoFundMe part that was written in our script. That is honestly a great
segue into what we'll be talking about today.
Commentary on capitalism and how my brain automatically prioritized the autistics that are creating things for the world, when in reality you shouldn't have to be a productive member of society to deserve to exist, because that's bullshit. Productivity is bullshit.
Yeah, or even just like the idea of productivity, which is what we're going to be talking about. So today's video we'll be talking specifically about capitalism, productivity culture, and ableism, and really how that just bleeds into our lives as disabled people.
With all that being said, let's get to the video.
So first, what is capitalism? So we googled it, and the literal definition of capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state.
Yes.
In terms of just like leading into what we want to talk about, capitalism itself is really, like, as we just read, like all about who controls the profit and like the profit of the labor. So like this isn't really going to be like a breakdown of capitalism itself, but more just like how productivity and being able to produce things is a crucial part of the way our society currently exists.
Okay, so hi again. You probably noticed that it is just me. Autumn is not in frame. Yeah, so we got through the intro part of the video, plus a couple extra tidbits, and then hit a pretty solid wall. So it's been a number of hours, at least one breakdown, and copious amounts of weed smoked later. And here I am. We have made the decision that Autumn is gonna sit this one out, because they're just way too overwhelmed with everything. Yeah, so Autumn did most of the script and all of the script, and they are currently sitting off camera for me to bounce ideas off of, because our videos don't really work unless both of us are here in some capacity. They don't have to be on camera though, which we have realized today. The thing that triggered Autumn's breakdown and their decision to not be in this video was we were just having a hard time with communication, which is a thing that happens a lot, but when it happens this often, it builds up, and at some point you hit that threshold and your frustration just comes flowing out, and you just need a break from everything, and that's super fair. Specifically for Autumn's situation, because they majored in speech communications, and communicating and words in general has always been a really big part of their life, a pretty big special interest. Yeah, and then generally just a good life skill, and also something they've used in terms of masking pretty heavily. Oftentimes when an autistic person experiences burnout, we will lose certain learned skills, for example those communication skills that are much more difficult to bring to the forefront than they used to be for Autumn. I've experienced a very similar loss of skills, also in the communication realm of things, but it happened a lot earlier in my life, so I've had numerous therapists and numerous years to kind of process the skills that I lost initially during my concussions, and then after that during the burnout after suffering through the concussions and then realizing afterward that I'm autistic. In terms of autistic burnout, oftentimes these skills that are lost and the like recovery and comeback from that burnout, these are going to be much longer lasting effects than a lot of people realize. Not for everyone, but it is not uncommon for burnout to take years to recover from. And honestly, to me, that makes perfect sense, because oftentimes it's because of years and years of working through a burnout that you didn't really realize you had, which is, I think, a very, very common experience, especially for undiagnosed autistics. One of the big reasons that people take a while to clue into the fact that they're actually burnt out is because capitalism just pushes us to like have our goal be working nonstop without breaks. That kind of internalized motivation that capitalism pushes on us, that we need to be doing something productive at all times and that rest is a waste of time, it's reinforced continuously by productivity culture that's being thrown at us from every angle. Specifically on social media is where I found it's the hardest to get away from. Yeah, a good example of that is something like hustle culture, or like stay on the grind kind of shit, with the implication that if you're not constantly working to make some kind of profit, you're not being a productive human. That's something that's been brought forward a lot more, especially during COVID-19, during the pandemic. So in terms of lockdown specifically, I've noticed a pretty dramatic uptick of posts specifically targeted at people who have been in isolation, and it's always somewhere along the lines of like, if you haven't learned X, Y, and Z during the pandemic, then you never lacked the time, you just lacked the motivation. Yeah, so the essence of those memes all boils down to like, if you didn't capitalize on X, Y, and Z during the pandemic when you had, quote, more time to, then the reality is that you just didn't care in the first place. That's obviously a pretty toxic mindset for a number of reasons. The first one that comes to mind is ableism. I feel like that one's pretty self-explanatory, especially when it comes to neurodivergences like ADHD and autism, when executive functioning is oftentimes one of the things that takes the biggest hit. And that means that it literally doesn't matter how much you care about what you're doing. Whatever mental block is just not letting you do it. Hustle culture is something that I have a lot of annoyance with. Like the whole, you have to have like 3 to 5 side hustles, otherwise you can't complain about anything wrong in your life because you're not trying hard enough. Yeah, that strikes me as a massive manipulation of the working class by capitalism as a structure, because it's literally taking the lifestyle that capitalism has made necessary, the like, oh, I literally need to work 5 jobs in order to pay my rent and have the basic amount of food on the table, if that. And then it's just been turned into like a glorified lifestyle, I guess, like something that's enviable. And I find that pretty disgusting, to be honest. Yeah. Yeah, it makes me really, really sad. One of the other fundamental issues with hustle culture is that it automatically turns every single hobby into something you should be monetizing. As soon as you assign monetary value to something that's supposed to be a hobby, something that's supposed to relax you and bring you joy, that makes it impossible to enjoy anymore. I know that's not true for everyone, but it's very common. I know for me, it's not so much the fact that the thing is monetized, it's the anxiety that comes with knowing I have to rely on that thing. And then it's that anxiety that then makes the thing unenjoyable, and then I can't bring myself to do it anymore. And yeah, it sucks. And then in terms of the next bullet point here, what does it mean to have your value dictated by your productivity? For a lot of neurotypical able-bodied people, it means that they feel great about themselves. So as we've mentioned in, I don't know how many of our videos so far, but at least a couple of them, the last few for sure. Both of us are relying on our parents. I've been relying on my parents for a number of years now because I've had so many various medical issues that have cropped up over the last decade or whatever. Currently my parents' financial support is under the condition that I am actively working on my healing, whatever that means. And for me, that has had a really big impact on how well I have actually been able to heal. Shout out to my therapist for helping me process these things and like figure out the source of a lot of my shit. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot recently has been how my financial support is contingent on my healing has led to a lot of guilt and a lot of heightened anxiety all the time, and it's also just overall stalled my healing. So I learned an interesting tidbit recently, and it was essentially that laziness is a myth. There's almost always gonna be a reason beyond I just don't wanna when someone says no about something, or like can't do something or won't do something, whatever the situation is. So what that essentially means is that procrastination isn't a spontaneous thing. It always has a source. There's always a reason that your brain won't let you do the thing. And for me, in terms of my healing, the reason my brain won't let me do the thing, and the thing can mean booking appointments, staying in contact with practitioners, going to appointments, honestly, like being kind to myself sensory-wise, eating for sure. The root of that those executive functioning issues, what I have realized is the anxiety that comes from knowing that progress in my healing. Yeah, so the root of my executive functioning is that anxiety, and the anxiety directly comes from my healing being associated with my monthly living expenses, and then that anxiety leads me to not do the things that I actually need to do to heal. On the one hand, because the executive functioning literally won't let me book the appointments and do all the practical things. But then on the other hand, like even if I could do all those things, the anxiety that I'm always feeling would stop me because of how much time it takes up and how much energy it takes up, that there just wouldn't be any room left for healing. And that brings me to the next point, which is just what is healing. That's been a big source of miscommunication in my life. A difference in goal when it comes to what we mean when we're talking about healing. Because what I mean when I talk about myself healing is that I want to get to a place in my life where I'm happy and comfortable in my body the majority of the time. A vast majority would be nice. And yeah, that's just nowhere near the case in my life right now, for many reasons. When it comes from a capitalist perspective, a lot of people interpret the end goal of healing as returning to a productive, profit-making existence, which is ironic because I've never had that existence because my first brain injury was when I was 12. So I've never been a functioning adult. It's interesting that my parents still expect me to be, even though I never have been anyway. How does having productivity-based value affect people? In terms of how it affects people in a practical sense, you can take burnout, for example. If you're healing from a burnout and your end goal and everyone around you's end goal is that you go back to whatever role in capitalist society that you initially had that burnt you out, then all that's going to lead to is another burnout. It's honestly just a factor of when, not if at that point, because you've already experienced one. Clearly capitalism isn't right for you. So it's really just a recipe for destruction. The only situation in which I would not apply that logic is a situation in which an autistic person has figured out exactly the accommodations they need in order to go back into whatever they want to do, and then they're met with like literally complete compliance. And that's a very unrealistic situation that someone is just gonna immediately grant all accommodations that a disabled person needs. It's just not the norm. And then in terms of like the hierarchy of capitalism, pretty much the higher your salary, the better the accommodations you're gonna get. Which doesn't help most disabled people, because in order to get to those high-paying jobs, you first need to go through the bottom rungs of that ladder. And those are the areas in which people are most likely to be burnt out. So it's really either, I don't know, sheer dumb luck if you make it through all that way, or more often than not, nepotism. I would be very happy to hear if anyone has had experiences with accommodating and accessible workplaces. I know I'm a little bit cynical when it comes to this stuff because I haven't seen it with my own eyes. So yeah, it would be great to hear if there is any positive experience around accommodations in the workplace. The next thing we're going to get into is functioning labels when it comes to autism, and then specifically the term Aspergers. So the origin of the term, and later on the diagnosis, it is no longer a diagnosis. Aspergers, for those of you who aren't aware of the historical context of the term Aspergers, Dr. Hans Asperger was a Nazi. He was a doctor who worked to experiment on autistic children with the goal of determining which ones were higher functioning and which ones were lower functioning. The ones that he deemed higher functioning were then labeled Aspergers. The people that were labeled as Aspergers were sent on to continue working as long as they could be, quote, productive, and the people that were labeled as low functioning were killed. This philosophy is the basis for how we view autistic people today and disabilities in general. So this is what we call eugenics. So in terms of Asperger's as a practical label, I know I have heard other autistic creators, after explaining why Asperger's is an anti-Semitic term, they still fall back to the whole, like, ultimately it comes down to an individual's choice on which labels to use for themselves. And that's always made me a little uncomfortable. That's not what I'm gonna say. To me, someone using the term Asperger's after being educated on the implications and the origin of the label, that tells me that you've made the decision to prioritize preserving your internalized ableism over deciding not to be anti-Semitic and laterally ableist. Beyond that, it's just not used as a diagnosis anymore, so it's like medically irrelevant. If you need that as an argument, your personal decisions as a disabled person can still be ableist. That's a very important thing to keep in mind, and those decisions can still harm other disabled people. Yeah, so further resources from a Jewish autistic person can be found on Rebecca Faith Quinn's account. We'll link all the relevant information below. Please go check out their content. They have been getting a lot of hate for speaking out about this stuff, so if you have the spoons, give them all of your love and support. Please and thank you. So in summary, it's one thing to use terms like Asperger's and high functioning out of sheer ignorance and lack of education, but it's a whole other thing to decide to continue using these terms after being provided the information you need to be aware of how harmful they are. If you are a person that has been educated and you still choose to label yourself as high functioning or Asperger's or both, I want you to ask yourself, why do you feel the need to distance yourself from people who are deemed low functioning? I don't want to know your answer to this question, so don't go run in the comments immediately. That's the last thing I want. I just want you to keep this to yourself and like properly think it through. And then just overall a clarification, it's never okay to use terms like functioning labels in reference to other people, including and especially if that person is a minor and under your care. Yeah, that's a pretty flat statement. I don't think I need to elaborate on that. At some point soon, we are hoping to make a quick video about the whole charity industrial complex and the recent uproar about Next for Autism. So one of the issues in the forefront of the whole concept of the charity industrial complex, specifically when it comes to autism, is that it really takes resources away from autistic people, in the sense that, I don't know, we're still relying on our parents, and yet charities like Next for Autism and Autism Speaks are getting, I don't know how much money every day to pay their salaries and to pay for ads talking about how autism harms allistic people just by our sheer existence. And it's really an awful allocation of money that's given under the guise of helping autistics. That's not what it's doing. Yeah, so the kind of donation and financial allocation that we actually need is stuff like mutual aid, GoFundMes, or just straight up literally giving your money directly to an autistic person. Universal basic income is something that Autumn and I talk about a lot in terms of how big of an impact that would make on the lives of most disabled people. Just being able to not worry about like very basic living expenses would allow disabled people to thrive, or at least give them the opportunity to, and properly decide for themselves whether or not they have the spoons to exist in society, as opposed to them being forced to exist in society at all times because they need to make money. Universal basic income would give disabled people the ability to exist and have their basic needs met without worrying about having to fight for their survival. If you are able to have your basic needs met and replenish your energy in a sustainable way, you'll be much better off. And it's really sad when we look at the common pushback against universal basic income, because all of it is rooted in ableism and white supremacy. Next week's video will be about our own sex education growing up, what misinformation we learned at school, home, and in the media, as well as what we wish we'd learned instead. Comment below any questions you have about accessible sex education and any other thoughts on today's video. See you next time. Bye.